In this video, we're going to look at critical thinking in academic writing. You might know that critical thinking is important at university, and that in assessment criteria for essays and other written work, criticality is essential for the higher grade bands. The assessment criteria might describe stronger writing as showing a high level of critical analysis, whilst work at the lower levels might be described as mostly descriptive, which means it lacks criticality. But what does critical thinking actually mean, and how do you show critical thinking in your writing? In this video, we'll look firstly at some definitions of critical thinking and why it's so important, and then we'll talk about some specific ways of demonstrating it in your writing. We'll also compare some examples of critical writing, which achieves high grades, with writing that is non-critical and achieves low grades. So what is critical thinking? It's important to realise that critical thinking has been defined in many different ways, and lecturers might mean different things when they tell you to be critical. Critical thinking has been described as an attitude of reflective skepticism. This means having an attitude of doubt towards what you're reading, or at least not accepting it until you've carefully questioned and evaluated it. It's also been described in terms of the goal of the thinking. It's thinking aimed at forming a judgment, such as deciding what to believe about a topic. This could mean giving your point of view where there are multiple conflicting viewpoints in the literature, or evaluating something and giving a judgment about its effectiveness or importance. In terms of the actual processes or skills involved, critical thinking has been described as justifying what you believe based on evidence. So it's about using information logically to support your points. To bring these aspects of critical thinking together, we may say that critical thinking involves being analytical, using reasoning to reach appropriate conclusions or inferences, evaluating information and making judgments about its validity, all with the goal of reaching a solution or decision as a result of this thinking process. In this video, we'll look at some different ways of demonstrating criticality in this broad sense, beyond the obvious one of pointing out weaknesses in others' work. First, though, to understand the difference between critical thinking and other kinds of thinking, take a look at this diagram, known as Bloom's taxonomy. Critical thinking involves the higher-order thinking skills at the top of the pyramid: analysing, evaluating, and creating. However, cognitive functions like remembering, that is, memorization, understanding and applying knowledge to new situations, are regarded as foundational, more basic types of thinking. In order to summarize somebody else's ideas, you only need to reach a certain level of understanding. But if you can evaluate what you've read and make an original argument of your own, then you've reached the highest levels of thinking. You've shown critical thinking. Everything in the pyramid, from remembering information up to evaluating it, is all necessary in order to enable you to create new knowledge. In the context of academic writing or university research, the ultimate goal is to develop original claims that advance the boundaries of knowledge and to support them effectively by analysing and evaluating evidence in an insightful way. So how can you actually demonstrate such higher-order thinking in your writing? There are many different ways, but we're going to take a look at some different features of criticality that tend to be found in writing that achieves higher grades, as well as in much published research. We'll start with what most people probably think of when they think of criticality, which is pointing out the weaknesses or limitations in the existing research. But it's important to remember that criticality, or the ability to evaluate other research, can also be demonstrated by identifying strengths. If you know how to evaluate a source, then you'll be able to recognise whether it's strong in a certain area or weak, and make an appropriate comment in your writing. When you do this, you're demonstrating an ability to think independently. You're analysing information and reaching your own judgment about its value, rather than simply describing or repeating the ideas of other people. Some of the key areas you can focus on when evaluating previous research are omissions, things the previous research did not do, the methods they used, and the conclusions reached. Let's start with omissions. This means that you can identify something that previous research has not considered, something that existing studies have made little attempt to explain, or ignored. So the weakness here is not a flaw or error in previous research, but simply something that was not considered in sufficient depth. This is common in introduction and literature review sections of research papers, where this weakness is pointed out because you intend to fill this knowledge gap in your paper. Remember, the reader expects that your work will contribute something new to the discussion, and sometimes this involves identifying weaknesses in previous research, in order to show how you intend to improve upon them in your own work. Next, a very important area to focus on when critically evaluating others' research is the methodology used. The types of things you can comment on here vary depending on the field, but in the social sciences, a big one is the sample used. How closely does it represent the population being studied? Do the views of the people who answered the researcher's questions actually reflect the views of the population in general? For example, consider an imaginary study on why international students choose to study in the UK. It used a sample of 40 international postgraduates, 10 from Europe, 10 from the USA, 10 from Africa, and 10 from China, at 5 universities in the south of England. How would this affect the conclusions? Well, we might observe that the conclusions cannot be taken as representative of the views of the whole UK international student population, because Chinese students, and East Asians in general, were underrepresented in the sample. In reality, Chinese students are the largest group of international students in the UK, but in Smith's sample, they amount to only a quarter of respondents, and so their views aren't given sufficient weight. To do evaluation of this kind, you need to compare the demographics or characteristics of the sample with the characteristics of the real-world population. You could also comment that Smith focused on postgraduates, and so the findings may not be generalisable to undergraduate students. This is not a weakness in itself, of course, because research papers can't cover everything. But if your own research question is about international students in general, then it's important to realise that Smith's findings can only tell you part of the answer to your question. You can also comment on the sample size. A good approach here is to consider not only how far it represents the actual population, but also whether the sample size is smaller or larger than that used in similar studies in the field, because different fields have different expectations for acceptable sample sizes. Finally, you also need to evaluate the conclusions of the source. Are they supported by the evidence in the paper or not? Consider this example. A study by Messerly, 2012, considered 23 countries and found that the more chocolate eaten per person, the higher the number of Nobel Prize winners per 10 million residents. So, can we conclude that eating more chocolate improves the cognitive functioning of individuals and helps a country produce more Nobel Prize winners? Well, there was a lot of media coverage of this study, but unfortunately this conclusion is not well supported. There is a surprising correlation here, but it's flawed logic to conclude that eating chocolate is responsible for or causes improved cognitive function and leads to winning more Nobel Prizes. More plausibly, other factors can explain both phenomena. For example, a similarly strong correlation exists between a country's standard of living, measured by their GDP, and both chocolate consumption and Nobel Prize winners. Alternatively, it could simply be a coincidence. Mirage et al. 2013 also show that the number of Nobel Prize winners in a country increases according to the number of IKEA stores, but we wouldn't say that opening more IKEA stores will increase the number of Nobel Prize winners. So whenever you see an article arguing that X caused Y, be very careful to evaluate the evidence provided. It's rarely possible to be 100% certain about any claim of causation, because it's very difficult to eliminate alternative explanations. This is especially true in the social sciences, where studies are not conducted in laboratories, but involve everyday people and the messiness of real life. Next, besides identifying limitations, another important way to demonstrate critical thinking in your writing is by evaluating the previous research as a whole and identifying the important issues for the reader to notice. Making appropriate generalisations involves critical thinking because it requires you to evaluate a lot of information in the literature and make a judgment about which points are important to mention and which are not. This example paragraph here is from a successful student essay. The only criticism of previous research is that the findings so far are inconclusive, but it makes a number of effective generalisations which show that the student has analysed the literature and successfully made connections between key ideas. For example, it identifies the chief, or most important focus, certain common points, and areas of unanimous agreement, things everybody agrees on in the literature. Criticality can also be demonstrated by considering both sides of a debate or argument. By comparing different perspectives or opinions, you show that you've considered the alternatives in a given situation, and haven't jumped to the first conclusion that you came across. For instance, in this example, the student quotes a source to support the point that one strategy is vital, but then immediately cites another source to add that the other strategies are also necessary. So in a simple but effective way, the student is putting together different perspectives towards the topic, and this contributes to the criticality of the writing. Finally, precision in the discussion of evidence is also a crucial component of and prerequisite for critical analysis. In this example, the student is very specific about each statement that he or she makes, and vague language is avoided. Cautious language, such as chiefly, is used to ensure accuracy, to avoid overgeneralizing, and to show an awareness of possible exceptions. There are also a number of additional statements that make the student's claims more precise, such as especially for less proficient listeners, which identifies a specific emphasis, as well as these even though statements, which add specific exceptions to the points in the first half of the sentence. So in this short paragraph, the student has evaluated a large amount of information in the literature and presented the key issues, shown an understanding of how the different perspectives relate to each other, and done so while using precise language to ensure the accuracy of the statements made. This also counts as critical thinking in the broad sense discussed at the start of the video, and although some lecturers might not be able to articulate it, these are the types of skills that they're looking for when they ask for more criticality in students' writing. Now compare the previous paragraph with a piece of writing which lacks criticality. This paragraph reports findings from 3 specific studies in a basically descriptive manner, without evaluating them. It lists 3 studies, Nathan 2008, Go 2008, and Vandegrift 2007, and describes them. No strengths or limitations are identified, and the significance of this information is not explained. The paragraph doesn't make any connections or comparisons between the 3 studies, and it doesn't highlight any points of importance from across the literature as a whole. The paragraph doesn't relate the findings of these 3 studies to the main trends in the literature. Some of the points are also vague rather than precise, such as many scholars, the reader wonders who in particular, or statistics, the reader wonders which statistical methods. To summarize, you can demonstrate criticality in a number of ways. By evaluating the methods and conclusions of sources, as well as omissions in what they discuss. We saw that this is particularly important where claims of causality are made, because alternative explanations are difficult to rule out completely, and assessing the extent to which alternative explanations remain possible is a key strategy for evaluating the overall conclusions. Finally, you can also demonstrate criticality in a broad sense by making generalisations across the literature, by showing awareness of multiple points of view, and making sure your points are precise by using cautious language and including a good degree of detail where necessary.